Yes, because I know the big thing in Vive was if you wanted to get concurrent stuff correct. And the way was, and so it really changed the entire design. If there's anything based on that, it's going to be total rewrites.
All right, guys, I think I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. This is the biggest PHP turnout I've ever seen. I've only been to 2 though, so I'll just introduce myself. I'm Aaron. I've been a PHP developer here in Phoenix for like 5 years now. I started in Tucson a year before that, so about 6 years total. I work at a company in Tempe called Synapse Studios, for which we have a couple representatives. We just build custom PHP apps with JavaScript front ends. Pretty cool stuff, actually. I was about to say pretty standard stuff, but it actually isn't the case a lot of the time. But in any case, I'm not. So I hope nobody came here expecting to hear from a Laravel expert. I started learning about Laravel in preparation for this talk that I'm giving right now. It's been on my radar for a long time. I've heard some really great things about Laravel as a framework, and generally in the past I've used CodeIgniter and Kohana, and we use Silex at work now. But CodeIgniter and Kohana are just garbage, and Kohana we thought was great for a long time, and then Laravel and others came along and proved to everybody that it wasn't. So I've never messed with Laravel, and I decided that as a talk, it might be interesting to spend a month, learn the basics, set up a project in a simple application, and then share with you guys, how I did it, what everything looks like, and any pitfalls, anything that I think is great about it, and all that stuff. So without further ado, just to get a general idea of the kind of experience in the room, is there anybody here with like less than a year of PHP programming experience? So I was talking to these guys already. Gordon, I know, so it doesn't. So there's going to be some things that I'm probably going to zip by, some important concepts a little bit. Feel free to interrupt me at all, because this isn't like the most structured of talks. So open to questions, input from the Laravel experts in the house. This guy right here. And yeah, other than that, I don't know, just an open talk. So first, Laravel is they have a pretty large set of tools. I was actually really surprised with the types of things you can do with a Laravel setup. So the first thing I wanted to show is just like, once you go through the Composer, if you have Composer installed and you just go through their quick Composer install, it's like Composer install local or global, I think is the keyword. They have a tool that just lets you do, I have the command written down here, so just don't screw it up. Laravel new, and then whatever the name of your project is. And then it breaks. Oh, it already exists because I did this. It says crafting application. It's really just downloading it. But it takes a couple seconds, and our Wi-Fi here probably isn't the fastest. But once it's done, you're kind of done. It's downloaded, and you have an application. If I wire this up to a server, it'll run, and it comes with some default behaviors. Actually, you can see over here, I've got this fancy Chrome, the gray Laravel home button, and all this stuff is just kind of their default little template that they give you. And they give you a basic user system just out of the box. I didn't play with it too much just because I don't really trust stuff like that, but I'm sure it's awesome. But yeah, I'm pretty impressed with their set of tools, and I'll go over more of them as we go. I didn't get too deep, and that's another thing you should expect from this talk is breadth rather than depth. There's not a lot of really serious detail here in what I'm going to do. but I want to cover most of the topics, the big bullet points, and hopefully you'll come away from it with some kind of understanding of what Laravel is all about. So I built some blog, and I'm gonna completely abandon that and then go to the actual thing that I built. And so here it is. It's a simple search box. I can search for somebody or something. It'll hit the API for Spotify. It'll populate it with some albums. Then I can click into them and see an album. This is the entirety of the application that I built. It's got some database access. It's hitting an API. The end. That's it. If I click on one of these, it'll play some music from their little preview library. But it's a super basic thing, and we can just kind of get into it. First, they provide for setting up your development environment, they provide a virtual machine. So everybody's used Vagrant? Anybody not use Vagrant? Vagrant is it's like a hard to describe. So it's basically like a way to set up local virtual machines for development, etc. They provide a Vagrant machine for you that you will install on your box, and it gives you a set of configurations, so you can just point to wherever your project is on your server or on your local machine, and it'll just be running, and you just set up, and it's actually kind of cool. When I first saw it, was immediately like, I don't want to use that, and just did my Vagrant setup the way I always do, which is I have a Vagrant file committed to the root of my project, so that way if you guys go to my GitHub page and check this out, you can just do Vagrant up. Theoretically, it'll run and be ready to go. But Homebrew, or not Homebrew, sorry, it's Homestead is something you can install locally, and it seems like a cool thing. It's not. I mean, I really like the idea of having a project that you can just check out and do Vagrant up without having to do any configuration on your own. But check it out if you're going to build some Laravel apps. It's definitely worth looking at. So with that out of the way, sorry I didn't get any detail, you guys. Laravel also provides a tool that wraps Gulp, which I was really surprised. So Gulp, for everybody who doesn't know, is like a JavaScript job runner thing. I can't really explain it any better than that. But you have you use Gulp to do things like compile your JavaScript or minify it for the front end. You use it to do things like set up browserify or live reloads and things like that. And if you've seen Gulp jobs, there's just JavaScript code that you create these little functions, and it's really not crazy to do. You learn Gulp. It takes some time, a little bit, but generally it's not too bad. These guys provide something called, in my notes, Elixir, which is their little wrapper for Gulp. So those of us who know a little bit about Gulp, we're used to seeing the Gulp file, and you would see a little bit more code in here usually for compiling less. You just say Elixir. This is actually the default for what comes with Laravel, as it's Gulp is set up to compile less. So then and less is a CSS language that compiles down to CSS and gives you some nice features for everybody who doesn't know. So now I can do Gulp watch on my command line. It'll take a couple seconds to compile, and I can go to my less file, and then you can see my wonderful CSS. And it's compiling on the fly. So this is less code. It just looks like CSS because I'm not really a serious CSS less guy. But it's kind of comes with this out of the box, which is really nice. You don't have to figure out how to set up Gulp for your project, and it's definitely worth using. So if you're building an application and you don't know anything about Sass or less or what's better or any of your whether you should use Webpack, Gulp, or Grunt, or any of those comparable tools. They give you Gulp, they give you less, and there's no reason not to just run with that if you don't have any biases other than that. So it's pretty nice, and generally I approve. So now we can actually talk about PHP. That's the reason why we're here. I got that out of the way. I'll let JavaScript and CSS malarkey. So let's start with the basic. For every PHP framework, there's going to be a way to do routing. Routing is just how you tell a URL, or tell your application, for this URL runs this code, and that's the basic idea there. So we have a routes file that I saw with my own eyes just now. So you can open it up, and the basics are, anybody who's done anything with Symfony or Silex or anything will recognize the way these routes work. In order to set up a new URL for your application, you type route, use get, or you can use match up above to match get requests or post requests, which is what I'm doing for my search page. But in this case, my simple example one is going to be, I'm going to get any get request to the route something will execute this function. This function is just going to be a diastring. What's up, guys? So simple hello world. Oh, simple routing. Pretty straightforward. If you've seen routing before, you hopefully will recognize what's going on there. Outside of that, so what's happening up here, just to get slightly more complicated routes out of the way. So this one that I have highlighted is for my album page. So this is the page that we saw here, listing, this is my album page. You can see that what I'm actually passing is an ID. This is how you do parameterized routes. Again, everybody who's done routing before will recognize this as just standard for good functionality. This is how I specify the controller that I'm passing my my route to handle. And the only other thing to show here is this route here, which handles both get and post requests. So, oh yeah, absolutely. Gordon, how do you do that?
Go to menu, under view, I believe.
Are you sure it's not edit? I feel like it's edit.
I think it's under like plus or something. Yeah, command column. What was the presentation? Just use presentation.
Yeah, you could do.
Is there? I've never. So, but the other thing is, I've also been trying PHP Storm for the last month. So I really. That was the first thing I tried.
Command Shift plus.
You were going in the right direction. Yeah, you were in the right spot. You just need to go to editor general, I believe.
Yeah, go to general itself. At the top is really fantastic.
Yeah.
You might just type font and it'll take you right to
Command plus mouse wheel. I don't have a mouse wheel.
Oh,
That's the opposite. All right, tell me when. Are we good? All right. Problem solved, you guys.
Do you want to share the repo too, since
I will share it. I don't know how useful that would be as a URL, but I can bring it up really quickly. It's my GitHub account is spruce-bruce. I'm not going to reveal any secrets about work while I'm here.
I'll post it everywhere.
Yeah.
Well.
So yeah, it'll be posted up if you guys want to grab it afterwards. But if you're interested in downloading it right now, you can find me, Spruce-Bruce, and it'll be probably the top of the list of repositories if you want to go grab it. So I was talking about match here. So for my search page, I'm responding to two HTTP requests types. So get and a post, which is pretty basic for this type of a thing. So I just executed get request. It goes and gets me my search form. I'm going to execute a post when I do my search for something else other than Paul. And I got, all right, I just thought that was fun. And anyway, so it does a post back to itself and responds to the post by hitting the API and returning some search results. So get and post, routing. Any questions on routing before we move along? I was planning on
the match, that's a new thing for Laravel 5, I assume? I've never seen it.
I do not know. I've only, I just downloaded Laravel.
I'm pretty sure that's pretty standard.
It's Symphony's routing, so.
Yeah, it's. My guess would be that if match itself was new, there would presumably be another way to do the same thing. I assume they don't make you redefine routes over and over again. So.
What's the app workflow? Where do these routes get defined?
Defined in.
I see that it's in routes.php, but is that a special file in a special location? Or do you have to configure somewhere, hey, go look in this file for my routes?
No, it exists by default. The routes.php already exists by default.
Right.
So it's like a top level file or something?
Yeah.
It's kind of buried in app, I think, isn't it?
It's not in the root. It's not in the root level. So if you're looking for it, it's going to be under your app directory here. I was about to point to the monitor right here. App directory, HTTP routes, and that's kind of where it is by default. I didn't go check to see if you can move it. I wouldn't be surprised if you can. So I would assume that you can move it. Is what I was trying to say. Right. There's not really. Yeah. It's up to you. If you don't like the file structure, which actually I'm not the biggest fan of the file structure. But I'm assuming you can. The other thing you can do, and probably wiser if you're building a larger app, is to define your routes inside your service providers so that they're kind of linked up with your actual functionality that will be using those routes for portability, modularity, and portability, and just so you don't get a massive routes file.
Is there another routes in console?
I don't know. Yeah, I would think not.
You just define your commands.
Yeah, I think you just define your commands in service provider. I assume. I haven't messed with the console stuff very much, but I would guess that's where you would do it. Service provider definitions. You've done it a lot, right?
A little bit, yeah. It's in 5 you kind of split up like console and HTTP. So that's what I was just.
I see.
Something in there. I think console's really just passing commands.
Okay.
Do you do anything special to get your namespace situation match up to folder structure?
This here.
Yeah. Do you do anything special? Or is that just by default?
So my base namespace will be. I think it's like, I don't remember what I set it as, but it's like Laravel experiment or something. And so.
Does that all get created when you initially set up the app?
Yeah, it does. And then it also, they have a command line tool called Artisan for doing a lot of interaction with the app, with the framework during development. And you can also set the main namespace with Artisan.
By default, it's app.
Yeah, by default, it's something crappy.
And then you can do Artisan app : name changes it, and then give it, whatever you want, and it'll change everything from app to whatever you want to call it.
So right now it's just looking for my controllers in the HTTP app HTTP controllers directory.
But it doesn't follow any sort of folder structure that emulates your namespace.
It will once you get to the controllers directory. Okay. So it is namespace beyond that, as you would expect based on the structure you're seeing here. So you can see that for my album controller, I have it in album controller. So I do know that you can change or at least I'm pretty sure you can also change the location of your controllers. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of the file structure, but I don't know if I would go out of my way to change it just out of laziness. Yeah, absolutely.
It's using the composer autoloader, so you can put whatever you want in.
That's true. So, any more questions on routing and how routing works and where it's looking and all that stuff? If not, then I'll move on to my controllers. So, for everybody who's not super familiar, I think most of us probably are, but a controller, I'll just really quickly define as controllers are essentially a thin layer to deal with incoming requests, is how you should think about your controllers. They take an HTTP request or a console command or any sort of something that needs to be acted upon. They decide what that action needs to be, and then they pass it on to deciding what that action needs to be. Actually, should be really, really simple. If it's complicated, you should pass it on to some other thing that is designed to know about your domain, what it is that you're working on. And so I'll show my controllers here in a second, and you'll see that they're just, they take a request, they take some variable, they pass it to my service layer, and then they take some output from the service layer, and the service layer does all the work for determining what we should be showing, or in terms of application. And then it takes your output from your service layer, passes it onto the view, and then the end. Controllers should be pretty dumb. So let's look at the album controller. So even though I increased my fonts,
Apparently it's per tab.
yeah. Oh, right. It's command and scroll wheel. Booyah. So my search. This is the function that runs whenever you hit my search page. It checks to see if there's line by line. It checks to see if there's a query posted to it. And normally you would do that. I would probably want to do this with a get parameter in the URL, but I wanted to show a post, so here we go. So I instantiated empty albums array. I go and get some albums if there is a query parameter present, and then I set up a simple data array, pass it to my view, end of controller. Sometimes controller will get a little bit more heavy than that, but ideally it shouldn't. Interestingly enough, the next thing I wanted to show was another set of kind of a convenience thing that Laravel provides, which is their way they do a REST API. So you can actually do pretty quickly. I actually have the commands right here. So I can make a controller using Artisan. So I will. That's my. Almost certainly. That. It's not great.
Yeah, like 6 characters.
Aha. So, PHP Artisan make controller. You'll actually find that there's this make command. You can do a lot of make things for boilerplates, so you don't have to, copy a file over, delete stuff out of it. It's actually kind of nice.
Artisan list will show you.
It will. So it's pretty much dumping a bunch of text to the screen, but I assume you guys are all fast readers.
Got it.
So this here is what we're doing. You can make a command. You can make I don't know what the difference between a console and a command is, but you can make controllers, events, middleware, et cetera. There's a lot of your base classes you can use the make command for. They'll make them in whatever your configured directory is for that particular thing. So when I execute make controller right now, it's just going to dump it in my root controller directory. And
They're really worth using because like if you make a command, it'll make the command and it'll make the command handler for you. So you really kind of want to learn to use the artisan tools.
Boilerplate, the testing stuff out too?
I don't think so.
No.
No, not from what I've seen. I just ran a make command so I can do git status and see what files it added. So it didn't actually add. I was going to ask you about the handler thing. So under if you do a command or a console thing, it'll add.
You have to do that.
If you make a command, it'll make a command handler.
Okay. So what I've done here, I've created a new controller called REST album. It boilerplates out these methods for you, and when I define the commands, the route for my REST album by uncommenting this, it's automatically routing to those methods depending on how you hit it. So if I make a request to just REST album right here, then it hits the index function. So double check what I set the URL as. So those of us who spend a lot of time making like boilerplate controllers, this is kind of cool. It's also a little bit magic, and a lot of people, including myself, are a little bit scared of magic. But this one is pretty nice. There's a lot of things which I'll point out as being kind of magical, and generally code creation is one of those things when you have a framework that's making code for you that I'm immediately wary of. But I actually like this. You get it helps you understand, I think, the ideal of what you should be doing with your controllers. And not every situation is ideal, but many of them can be. So you have an index for getting. So this is where I would do my RESTful get. It has create, which is supposed to return. It's another get method. So if I do get / REST album / create, or it'll call this. The purpose of the create method is to return a form, which isn't very RESTful. It's kind of odd that it's here, but it's just a general controller thing. So it's not the make controller command isn't just for RESTful controllers. So there's that. And I don't remember exactly how all these map. Store is a post request. Show is get single is probably what that is. Edit is a put request, or it might be get the form, but we get the idea. Update is probably the put request, and then destroy the delete request. So those are all mapped to various HTTP method verbs, as they call them, and yeah, it's I actually kind of like it. I like that it does that, and it's pretty easy to override if you need more customized functionality.
If you don't use them.
Yeah, just kill them, get rid of them. My guess is that this route here is kind of setting up a blanket set of routes that point to that controller. So you probably get some interesting errors from it if you try and hit some of those missing functions. That would be different from what you would normally want. I think you would normally want a 404 for hitting a route that doesn't exist. I wouldn't be surprised if you get a 500 from hitting a route that just is defined but doesn't have a function for it. But I haven't tested it. We can test it though, actually, really quickly by killing. That's the wrong file. I heard the magic word service provider.
Yeah, I was just confused on the album controller.php, how at the very top the constructor had parameters of the spot on the service.
Yeah.
I was curious how it was configured.
I will absolutely talk about that. That's a big deal in Laravel, and actually is the source of one of my beefs with Laravel. But we'll get to that. Hopefully, it's super important. So if I'm running low on time, actually, I'm taking a long time.
You've been to these before. They sometimes go an hour, sometimes go 2.5.
Yeah. So
We won't go 2.5.
You're like, well, I won't be
look,
going
you
2.5.
guys need to be locked down for 3 hours. I can't. No, I'm just kidding.
At an hour and a half.
Josh is not presenting, so we should make 2.5 hours. Oh, snap.
So here's our fancy. That's a 404. It looks like.
It's like, I gotta work on it.
Nope, 500. Nailed it. I guessed it right. So 500s, you don't really want a 500 for going to a route that doesn't exist. You want a 404. It kind of matters, but it also, if it works, it works. Do what you need to do. But if you're just killing, if you're not using all of them, I would look into how to make sure that you're returning a 404 or redefine the routes so you're not actually routing to things that don't exist. Is how I would prefer to go about doing that. So let's get back to search. So as I don't know your name pointed out, I'm kind of magically getting something in the controller here. I have my construct method, and it's pulling 2 services, and these are classes that I created. I'll get into how those make it into my controller. It's a little bit magic, but it's the topic. The high level is magic answer is dependency injection, and for now, that's what it is. And then I'll hit you with some more detail here in a minute.
I like magic.
All right, so I did all I wanted to do with controllers. Does anybody else have any questions about what's going on with the simple?
Where do you do validation?
I didn't.
Well, that's an easy answer.
I didn't even think about validation as a thing because I hate doing it, but my guess is that it would be done on the model level. You would probably define rules either in your model or somehow, related to it. Now that you mention it, I didn't see a single thing. Do you know how you do?
Probably the presentation.
I mean, it depends on what you wanted to do. Like for this here, like if you wanted to like validate that there was a query, I think you'd have to put it here, I think.
Right. But I think what we're talking about is if I'm doing a post for a new record, if I'm accepting like a user to upload, create a new album, for example, and I expect for there to be a name, and I say you can't create an album unless you have a name.
I mean, there's definitely both use cases. Like in this case, you're hitting an API. It might have a max thing you can search for.
Right.
Validating it there before doing an API request
Mm-hmm.
to get an error back from an external service seems pretty smart.
So what would you do then? Would you return back a different view? So like say an error page or a warning page?
I don't know.
Instead, or?
Yeah.
It's case by case. If you're,
I think that model has the validator help.
yeah, I would expect it to. Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't get into it. It's actually an important topic that I just completely spaced, but
Yeah, there's validation built in. Where you're going to put it's going to depend on what you're doing.
Yeah.
Like anything else.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, if query. I mean, do you check and see if there's valid data?
Yeah, it's sort of validation.
It's minimalistic. And it's
But I think maybe another good thing to point out here though is like in line 39 there, I'm pretty sure that if you do request input, you do have some basic filtering already applied.
Mm. Meaning if I have a request object, it's already gone through some sort of filtering.
Yeah, make sure that somebody's not passing in PHP tags.
Sure.
It has some basic.
Just
stuff
the things you would expect from an input filter. So trimming, maybe.
I doubt it would be trimmed.
Okay.
Not unless you like did something more like with the validator. Where you could just add that in as well.
All right. Well, in that case, I'm going to move on to views. So you can see here my last line is building a view. This is another area where Laravel has kind of rolled their own thing. They have a templating engine called Blade. There are lots of templating engines out there. Mustache and Handlebars are kind of the big ones right now. But there are about 100,000 of them. I've never used the same one between 2 projects. I've had to learn about 1,000. And so now I had to learn a little bit about the 1,001st. But I actually like it. I actually like Blade a lot. So this is my kind of main template wrapper thing. This is, I think we'll all recognize the basic head tags and all this stuff. What we do down here is they have this yield keyword, so yield content. And that means for many of my other views, I get to say this goes in the content section. So when I get to my search view, I say this extends app. App is the name of the template that I was just looking at. I say this section goes in content, so it just goes right in the middle of the HTML. And then I get my, I think we'll all recognize most of this. They do, excuse me, they do provide some CSRF functionality. If you don't include this, it'll error out on your posts. For those that aren't aware, it stands for cross-site request forgery. So it's to prevent people from hitting your post endpoints without having hit your form first.
Is that triple braces intentional? Or?
Probably not.
Okay. I just wasn't sure if, like, for special function calls, we would.
I think are you using 5.0?
I'm using whatever was
Yeah.
newest a month ago.
This is something that changed between 4.3 and 5.0, where like double braces was echo and triple braces was like
still have
echo
three on the
unescaped or something like that. And it's recently changed. I think maybe right now, I'm actually surprised that both of them work. I think you have to do.
They don't both work. That's what I was just testing.
Okay.
You still have 3 on the.
Oh, I did?
Yeah.
Come on, PHP Storm.
Docs are saying triple.
Okay.
Well, I guess I wouldn't expect search results to come back from that.
Just a comment here. I ran into an issue when playing with Laravel that Angular as well.
Yeah, that is.
So that doesn't really play really well as Angular also uses. So overly abstracted.
There
You
is.
can change it somewhere.
Yeah, you can change. I don't know if you can change it within Blade, but you can change it within Laravel or within Angular.
I can't remember
You
where.
can change it to Laravel as well. In the docs, he tells how to do it.
Because Laravel uses the same, or not Laravel, Angular JS uses the same double brackets like that.
Yeah.
So it ends up causing issues if you try to use Angular
With Blade.
with Blade. Yeah, so one of them's got to give. So I know you can do it with Angular. I don't know if you can.
Interesting.
But if he says you can do it,
Yeah.
Yeah, I know you can change it. I just, it's like everything else. You can change everything, but you want to make sure you have a good reason to.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's a good reason.
Yeah, if you need to use Angular with your Blade templates, then you'll have to change it.
And you don't have to use Blade either. So if you've just got like in one of my tooling apps, I'm just using Angular on one thing, and I don't even use Blade.
Right, that's a good point. Blade, as well as most templating in general, is pretty optional. You can just go raw PHP right here if you need to. Templating is kind of nice. I kind of give it a hard time, but it's pretty standard to be using around. So you can do just straight PHP. I'm sure you could plug in Handlebars or Mustache or any other preferred templating engines as you like. Blade is packaged. Blade's actually pretty nice. If you're not using Angular, there's not really any reason not to use it. And that's Blade. That's Blade right there. So that's all I wanted to cover about views. I told you guys about the CSRF function. Okay, so now we're getting to the serious part where we're talking about the service providers and dependency injection. So dependency injection, for those that don't know, is pretty simply defined as when you have a class, it shouldn't really instantiate the objects it's using, its services and things like that itself. It should rely on those to be passed into it. And the reason you do that is it makes it much easier to test. You don't rely on a lot of like magical globals and things like that. So a lot of times in older frameworks, you'll see people relying a lot on singletons to do the same thing. And as a community, we've all kind of decided that singletons should be avoided unless you have like a pretty legitimate use case that it kind of leads to really hard to test and global namespacey code. So with that in mind, we'll talk about what's happening to get these services into my controller. Because you'll notice that what you might expect is when you define your routes, you also say this also needs to take these to objects. We don't define it here at all. We don't define it, but we do have, man, man, this monitor is really hard to read. We do have a set of service providers. Which right here, we have the one that's kind of basic for everybody. This is this here binds the two provided services. Are we? I'm sorry. So these two lines bind my user classes that are provided by Laravel, which I don't know anything about. And this third one is binding my album service, the class that I created. So when I say bind, what I'm saying is that I am setting these in my service container. So the service container is, you can think of it as like, you know, it wraps the application classes themselves, and it provides, it's what's responsible for delivering to you the classes that you ask for in your controllers. This does dependency injection a little bit magically. So when I am here and I'm saying I just bind the album service, this is all I had to do to get dependency injection working. So I added my class here, my Spotify example /services/album service, which references this file right here. And then all I had to do in my controller was type hint the parameter. I'm pointing to the monitor again. So all I had to do was do this type hinting right here. I say I want my album service, and it passes it into the controller automatically. On the one hand, it means that I don't have to have, you know, the pimple defines everywhere. For this class requires, you know, X, Y, and Z, so I don't have a bunch of verbose defines. But it also means that if I'm not familiar with Laravel and I see this controller, I can't find out where these things are coming from without looking at the Laravel docs, which is in itself kind of irritating. But ultimately, Laravel has made some decisions for basically just speed of development. So because I don't have to go and define the inputs into my controller's constructor, I don't have to spend that time creating a set of files. I don't have to worry about what happens if I need a new thing. I need to go find it and update it. So there's a little bit less developer overhead that you get with a little bit less clarity.
Does it provide the same instance in every class?
You can do, so in this case, I believe what it's doing is a new instance every time. I'm not super convinced that that's what's happening.
It's definable.
It is definable.
You can do a singleton. You can have it return a new instance every time, return the same instance every time. You define that in the service provider itself.
So the next thing I was going to show is actually I've created two services. So one is the Spotify service down here, and that's just my interface to the API. I'll show it, but it's not really super relevant to Laravel code. But what I did do is create this Spotify API service to show, or the service provider here, to show where you would start to add more complicated service provider logic. So what I was showing before is I have a really basic service service. It's just a class that needs to be passed around my app. I can define it here, and I can just type hint it and get it anywhere I want. If I have specific requirements for how that thing needs to be instantiated, though, you create your own service provider. And from here, you have a register method. The register method is where you define how your service gets instantiated. In my case, it's very simple. I just return new whatever. It also contains the boot, which is where you might register event handlers. Actually, that might not be true, but in this file is you can register event handlers. You can also register routes in here, which I didn't play around with too much.
You can read in, like, if you have to have a config, like if you need an API key or something, you'd put that in here. So like if your Spotify service constructor needed your API token and secret or something like that, you could put that in here to read that from the
That's exactly right. So in order to prevent from defining config dependencies in my Spotify service, for example, I might pass those config dependencies from here. And this is, I think, going to be an important file for anybody making a real Spotify app or a Laravel app, sorry, I would probably look at defining the bulk of my routes inside of service providers, just so they're well associated with the domain that they're operating on. It's an important file. Mine's really light because my application is itself really light, but this is actually a big concept here.
How did you register that provider?
Like a third-party library and you kind of want to make it very easily adaptable for Laravel. Like I have a PHP API client library for my product, and you can just add a couple things into your library to make it really easy for Laravel, where you have the service provider in there. You can also have a default config file, and then you can do an artisan command that you do artisan vendor publish, and it will copy that config file into the area where the config goes, so that it's real simple for somebody to get up and running. And if you're, with Laravel, all the config stuff you really should be reading from the .env file, and so you would just use like getenv, API_token or something like that. But you can basically create the config file and allow them to publish it directly into the correct directory, so it makes it real simple for somebody using your library to go in and make sure they're defining the right things.
Yes, so I don't touch on config at all, but that was good. But yeah, it's an important part of most applications, and I assume what you meant by the env file is the actual environment variables.
The .env file,
Oh.
or I think it uses a .env library, and
Okay.
I think that it'll either read it from the actual environment, or you can configure it in the .env
Okay.
file as well.
Okay, that's good to know. So yeah, so if you're API keys, any sort of things that might change depending on your environment that you don't want to, you definitely want to keep that stuff.
You put in there and just set your get ignore on .env.
Right.
And there's usually a .env sample or example, I think, that you would take and then copy that and rename it to .env.
Yeah, there are a bunch of examples here, and this looks like a pretty straightforward Bash interface. So recommend looking into that for anybody making an actual Laravel app. So this, to answer your question, is how you register your service providers. So I've only got the one because the other one I just kind of stuck it in the middle of the global kind of generic app service provider. So you just add it to this list, and I was actually surprised to see how long the list is here. These are probably for facades.
Yeah, those are the facade aliases.
But this is a list of service providers. Laravel provides a lot of stuff. So one thing I might recommend is coming through here and seeing, like, I don't use some of these things, but then you also might be worried about getting rid of things that some of the things you do use, dependencies and such like that. But it's pretty reasonable to guess that some of these are going to be worthless for your sort of app. So you might want to come in and prune some of those.
I'm pretty sure he doesn't register anything that you're not actually using. So
Yeah,
you
there's
probably
also
need to shoot yourself in the foot by doing that.
right. There's also some pretty robust sort of deferred loading things in here. So you can set up your services so that they either just load right away, right when the app bootstraps, or they'll wait until they're actually used. So he's right. A lot of these things that are in here, they probably don't add much of a loading burden. They're probably pretty thoughtful. I've actually come to believe that the guys who built Laravel more or less know what they're doing. So I wouldn't be too worried about it. But it was super surprising to me when I first saw it.
usually just put my service providers right there,
Right.
rather than in the other spot where you put it.
Mm-hmm.
There's reasons you would put it in the app service provider, like if you wanted to detect the environment and kind of optionally load one, like maybe you have a dev only type of thing. You would put it in the app service provider again, but most of the time I just put mine directly there.
Oh yeah, and I actually show that this last one here is mine. So yeah, that's how you would register. This is probably the more common way, like you said, that you would register your service providers is you register one here, and then you have your service provider function or class that has the service provider functions that are all.
And if you wanted to defer that, you were talking about, you could defer it so it's not even instantiated or anything until it's actually used. It's just simply a class variable that's deferred true.
I see what you're saying. So it's like protected or public.
Yeah, I don't know if it's public or protected or.
I would assume
Literally,
it's.
like you said, defer equal. I think just defer. True, and then like it knows.
So yeah, so what he's saying is that now theoretically, if this is the correct variable and the correct if it's actually public, then when this doesn't get loaded into the from the file system until it's actually used, which is a important feature.
Yeah, for like an API library, if you have routes where you're not actually hitting the API,
Mm-hmm.
if you defer, then you're sure that you're never even like loading up any of that code.
Yes. So, yeah, definitely worth looking into. And their docs are actually really good compared to, say, Kohana's. They cover a lot of this stuff in pretty serious detail. And a lot of that stuff I'm not going to be able to get into. But things like that. And the service provider especially has a lot of interesting features to it. I would really heavily recommend, if you're building a serious application, to look closely at their documentation on this. So the next thing I wanted to cover related to service providers was something we touched on a little bit in the previous file, which are the idea of facades. So the reason that one reason you'll see a lot of bad practices. There's two specifically. One is using singletons a lot where they're not necessary, and also using like a lot of static functions on your classes because the syntax is kind of nice. If I can say like, class : function and not have to worry about like dependency injection, that's it's pretty nice syntax, but it makes it really hard to do unit testing. And if you're not doing unit testing now and you're not planning on doing unit testing, you might think that it's worthwhile to just not care about it. But if you're maintaining an existing app and you're having serious problems with bugs and just brittle code in general, unit testing is fantastic. So be wary of using some of those features that make unit testing hard up front. That way, if you decide that you want to do unit testing and you're not, you don't have to refactor your whole application. So
there's no like built-in mechanism for testing in Laravel?
it uses PHP unit, so it's not built in. it's not built in. Laravel doesn't provide their own. I don't have any tests written up, but they do have, I assume, like an artisan command. Do you want to?
You can use anything. I started playing around with Behat the other day.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you can tie anything into it.
Even if you're not doing any testing, dependency injection is still worth it.
Yeah.
After you use it for the first couple of things, you're like, wow, it's just simpler. It's made my code more understandable because all my dependencies are right there in the constructor. And you're spending less time creating lists of classes. All you're doing is adding a little bit of config at the top of the class, and you're done. It really is a win.
I was expecting to find a test command here.
No, I think it's because they leave it up to you pick whatever you want. If you want to use Behat or Codeception or whatever, there's generally Laravel libraries for each of those. So like if you wanted to use Behat, Laracast, it's a great video series. They've got some. So all you do is you got a couple things in your composer library that kind of just makes it real easy.
They do have a section in their documentation about testing too, which is they provide a PHP unit kind of examples here and whatnot. So they don't have their own testing library, but I don't know if I would trust them if they did.
And if you're looking like on packages, searching for composer-ified packages, there'll be Laravel versions of a lot of the major libraries that have the service providers there to set them up for you.
So next, I'm just going to quickly show you guys my Spotify service, just so there's no magic. This is all I'm doing to hit Spotify's API. They have actually pretty cool API. So if you're into playing with APIs, especially music APIs, they have something that's pretty cool. These are just open. I didn't have to mess with OAuth to go hit these and get this data. I'm using Guzzle clients.
Do you have to register to get an API key from them?
No. Nope, they're just fully open. I can actually go to these URLs in the browser and it spits back JSON. It was actually a huge requirement for me for building this, is I didn't want to mess with OAuth at all. I pretty much hate it. So we have two methods: search, get album. Search takes a query from my controller and hits their API, their search API. This stuff should be pretty straightforward. I'm basically hard coding and saying only search for albums. They have a bunch of other cool stuff you can do. The get album method is just hitting their API specifically for a single album worth of information. Interestingly enough, the search API returns album objects that have less information in them than when you hit the album API endpoint, which makes sense. So you'll see that I have some code later where I started down the path of just saving albums when I do a search to the database, and then I realized that I was getting different data, and I was like, well, I can just write some stuff to update them with the new album data just to show interaction with the database. But it's actually pretty stupid what I did. But you get to see some database interaction, which is actually super important. So next, database interaction. They provide their own set of migration tools. They're actually pretty nice. They're not doing stuff which I believe Doctrine will look at your entities or your models and just kind of assume that based on your definitions in your model, it'll build a table for you. So I'm actually manually setting up some migrations here, but it's not too bad. Oh, that's not it. So again, there's a artisan make command, and it creates this file for you. It can take some arguments, and it'll set up either your create or your just your update sort of commands for you. They provide the schema object. Actually, I did skip something. I did skip explaining what facades were. Schema here is a facade, and it looks like I'm accessing the schema object itself as if it were static variables or static functions on the schema object, but it's a facade. It's an interface that lets you kind of magically interact with injected classes in the service container. So there are these kind of global classes that exist. Like schema, you can set up your own facades, and then you can interact with them using the fancy, the nice looking static syntax. But they're fully mockable in your tests, and it gets rid of some of the downsides of using of using static methods while at the same time providing you the syntax. I don't really like it a whole lot. I prefer just injecting stuff, but here you go. If you like the syntax enough, here you go. You can define your facades. So this is where I'm creating my tables. I only need 3 tables. You can see from all of the list of migrations here, I went through a couple iterations, and I'm going to kind of quickly skim through those. But so I have a table, I have an ID. I'm just using the Spotify character ID, so it's just a string. It makes a varchar length 30 in the database. I'm using strings for everything here. So type is, again, this is all just straight from the Spotify database. And then I set my primary key to the ID field. I'm not going to go into too much detail there. This is me realizing that I needed more, I needed more space for my album type because I have something that's longer than 10 characters, and realizing I need to change it. Left it to show you guys all that. Realizing I forgot to add a name field, so I added the name with just the PHP default 255, which is kind of a weird that became the default, but There it is. This is me creating an images table. Again, the new thing here is 1, timestamps. This method will create 2 fields on your table. I believe it's created and updated. So, and I'll show in a minute that you can, in your models, tell it either I care about these or I don't care about these, and then Laravel will kind of set them automatically. It's nice because that's something you end up doing a lot. Again, if you don't like magic, it's magic. But generally, I don't have too much beef with that one. This is me setting up a foreign key. Syntax here is actually pretty nice. Foreign album ID references ID on albums. If you're familiar at all with how databases work, that should read like a sentence to you and be pretty clear what's going on. I don't want to dwell too much on it. I will say that I kind of wanted to use a composite primary key here. So I was going to show that one option when doing stuff like this is to use 2 fields as your primary key together. It's a technique. It's something you, for whatever reason, you don't see a whole lot. It's kind of a weird thing to do sometimes, but sometimes it makes sense, and you just absolutely cannot do it in Laravel.
I think it's coming, but yeah, it's completely fucked if you try to do it.
Yeah, you just can't do it, and that is when I get to my conclusions later.
You can do it, but then you can't use a lot of the cool Laravel's kind of ORM is called Eloquent. You'll run into problems using some of the built-in Eloquent stuff if you try to do a compound key.
Right. So that's better. So if you do, you'll run into a lot of roadblocks when you're trying to use Laravel's tools. If you're using compound keys, I think I said composite keys, which I don't think is the right term. It just got corrected. But I hate that. I hate when a framework restricts the way you try and use your database. It sounds like they're not trying to restrict you. They just don't have it supported yet, which is better than them being like, no, it's bad, the Kohana style. Like, nah, you're doing it wrong.
It's just something that Taylor never needed.
Right.
So he never built it. And
Mm-hmm.
And then if you wait for the table is, there's 3 keys listed as a composite key. So the combination of those 3 keys.
Yeah. So are you using the Eloquent features? Really? Maybe we're just wrong.
yeah,
From what I could tell,
I know I tried to use it and I just gave up.
yeah, I kind of had the same thing where I was going to do a composite key, and I just kind of started looking into it.
All right, next month, show us your magic.
I know. So apparently it works, and we're wrong. But so I might take back that beef if it turns out that I'm just completely wrong.
Okay, so you're not doing, so it's kind of just a workaround that you're doing like a pivot on it.
But he's got a table with that is a pivot table with 3.
I don't
3
think you can
fields that are-
select, like you can't do like some of the sort of basic stuff. Like you could, like if your users table, or let's go tags, because tags would be something you probably use that for. If you had a tags table, I don't think you could do tags and then get or whatever, and then specify an array as you. That's what I'm used to, like from like Zen framework. Where you would do an array would be your 2 key values or 3 key values. Really, it works.
So if it's in, that's awesome. That's
Yeah,
great
yeah.
news. That makes Laravel much more
How
appealing to
long
me.
have you been using that?
Since January.
Really? All right.
So
No,
I know this guy sucks. Get out of here, you. No. So the migrations they provide. If you guys are familiar at all with a lot of different migration systems, you'll see I have an up and a down method. Up is just when I'm running the migrations, this is what happens. If I want to roll it back, I can specify what happens in a rollback in my down method, and it should or theoretically undoes what you do in the in the up method. You can do whatever you want, but that's the idea. So now we're going to talk about models and eloquence, and we're going to get into the actual logic of my album service and how I'm storing stuff in the database. And with a typical PHP app, a lot of times database interaction is basically like the center of what you're doing. And so I often judge a whole framework based on how you interact with it, how they recommend you interact with the database. And a lot of times you don't have to do it their way. So I imagine in Laravel's case, I could just not use eloquent and use either straight queries if I'm a maniac, or you know, whatever other method I choose to use. But for this, we're going to be using their way, and their way is not actually that bad. So that's good news. So let's open up the album service. So I've got kind of a mess here because, like I said, I did some stupid things. But what I'm doing is I'm handing off the search command for my controller to the album service. You know, my search goes to the Spotify service, executes the search on the API. I get some records back. I instantiate an empty albums array. I go through and I run my get albums for Spotify search item. So this is an individual item at this point. And this is the first method we see me calling on my model, my album model, which I'll show here in just a second. So all I'm saying is, if the album exists, give me that album. If it doesn't exist, create an album object. You can also do first or create. So that's first or new. You can do first or create, which says, give me the album if it exists, or create the album in the database if it doesn't exist. And so in this case, since I'm only passing it the ID, I didn't want to create it in the database yet because I'm about to give it a whole bunch of other stuff, and I don't want to run two queries when I don't need to. And that said, let's go look at album itself. So I've got a lot of comments in here. You should recognize some of these if you've messed with ORMs in other frameworks before. Here you define the table. It will use your class name, pluralized, and I believe snake case, as the default table name. And I found in the past that defaults make me angry. They don't always behave. Like, you have to know exactly how they're going to behave. Otherwise, you're going to be like, what the hell's going on? And it turns out it's some weird default behavior. So, but that one makes sense as long as that's actually what it does. Your class name, snake case, pluralized, is the name of the default name of the table. You can always just define it. Same with primary key. It's always going to default to ID. I wrote here that you can't have composite primary keys, which it turns out I'm probably wrong about. I also wrote boo, which I take back. So
is that where you specified the compound key?
Yeah. No. Let's see. That's bad. So I do has many relationships. So I created some traits. So I have a structure where I have apps, and then I've got users, and those users are assigned permissions and roles. So different roles have different permissions, but each role is assigned to a different app. So I had to create a three-way relationship between apps, roles, and users, and I have to be able to load. You know, if I have a user, I should be able to load all of their apps. If I have an app, I should be able to load all the users associated to it. So I had to create that three-way pivot. So what I did is give you an example. So I've got a person object who belongs to, so I've got a user who's belonged to a person. That's the
He has a pivot table.
So you're not actually loading that pivot,
So-
you're loading a thing and then you're going through.
yeah, it sounds like, so when you set up your relationship, you define the individual, the path through your pivot table on the relationship, but do you have a model set up for your 3ID pivot table at all?
Oh, that's, they don't work.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's where we're different. You can't do a model. with
Right.
like
You
that.
can, yeah. So just to clarify, you can create what he's done, and you can create a pivot table, a table that defines a relationship between a many relationship between entities, and use composite or compound keys on it, because you're not going to define a model and really be interacting with those records on a individual basis. So those will help you define your relationships, and that's actually probably you'll find a lot of times that's where you want to use compound keys in a situation like what you've had. And it sounds like Laravel will not restrict you based on that. But I think as soon as you want to define a model based off of the table with compound keys, it sounds like you're still going to have problems. Like what I would expect to see, say, in my images is to be able to define a key this way, a primary key, where some other ID. And I don't think, I'm not sure that you can define an array here or any sort of compound keys, which isn't the biggest downside. It's not. This wouldn't be the only ORM that doesn't let you do that on your models. But anyway, so the next step is we have this idea of fillable and guarded properties on your model. All this is doing is letting you define explicitly or implicitly what can be set automatically by a model's constructor. So when I say, new album and I pass an array in, if I pass something in here that's just arbitrary, it'll set it if I let it. And so when I say fillable, I'm defining these things are settable using the constructor. When I say guarded, I say nothing is guarded. So I'm basically saying everything on my object here is I can set with the constructor. A lot of ORMs will have you defining all your properties, all your fields right here on the model. Again, this is something Laravel does to speed up development time with the with a small loss in clarity. So if it's possible for me to have a model defined with no fields listed on it, and so in order to know what fields I can expect from this model, I would have to go directly to the database or just be the person who wrote it and know what it is. But I also have the option of defining them all right here in the fillable, which I would recommend if you're working on a team larger than one. You might look into doing stuff like that just for your teammates' sake. On the album, I'm not using an auto-incrementing ID, so I set incrementing to false. I'm not using the timestamps feature, so I set timestamps to false, so it doesn't try and set things on a table where those fields don't exist. And then these are the relationships. These ideas right here are the main reason I like ORMs. That I can define this relationship. This is to me the main feature of an ORM is that I can just call images on an object and get back all its images. And this has a really nice expressive way to define your relationships. So just say this has many image, and it's set up. So I have an image model set up, and it returns instances of those image classes. There's a lot of functionality around how you set these relationships up. Sounds like we've got a pretty complicated setup over here. It seems pretty powerful to me how you define your relationships. You can set up many relationships through pivot tables. You can set up. He mentioned passing this idea of eager loading, which is a way of loading all of a object's children in one query instead of having to run a single query for each record that you're trying to get back. So theoretically I can instantiate this album plus all of its images with running 2 queries. Those of you who are know what a database is, know that there's joins, and it's theoretically you can do it with one, but nobody wants to write that logic. So, again, there's always trade-offs and stuff like this, but for some performance loss, you'll get this really nice syntax for defining your relationships in your code, and I actually like the syntax a lot. So let's see.
Is fillable and guarded at those both normal terms or expected in the model?
They're not. They both have defaults, so you don't have to set them. I'll just a second. But and as far as I know, I've never heard those terms outside of Laravel itself. So they might be standard terms, maybe, but I've never heard of them before.
It's something he got from Rails.
Is it?
Yeah.
I don't care
I'm not
about
sure,
Ruby.
but he got it from somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly. So.
Some things that as when you're searching is caching, so you can cache regular database requests.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't seem to see anything about caching requests. So I'm wondering if you
I didn't see any too much. I would guess that there's something. I just kind of have to stop myself right now from just going to their docs and looking at it. But I would say let's spend some time afterwards. Let's look at it, because I bet there's something you can find. Because they do have a Redis library, which maybe they're using for a queue instead of for caching.
I'm not sure. There's some caching stuff built in. I'm not sure how you cache an eloquent.
I'd be pretty surprised if there's not something. I'd be pretty surprised if we can't find it. So why don't we? I'll get with you and let's sit down and see if we can ferret that out. I bet there's something.
I was just going to mention there's another cool thing you can do in your model. I think it's transform, public function transform.
Yeah.
So that like if you have a column that's email and you want to make sure it's always lowercase, you can do just public function transform, and then in there you can do you set this email equal lowercase email, or if you like to have null for some of your columns, like I put in there, if it's empty, then set it to null in case somebody passes it in case you get an empty string somehow. That way you're not putting the empty string in the column.
What does that transform happen? Is that like
It's-
when you call save?
It's whenever you set that property. I think so, yeah.
You have to go through some setter function for it to be smart enough to do
I don't think you can do a setter function. I think it's just literally.
So
I have to look at the docs to tell you for sure, but I know you can do it, and it's kind of nice.
to answer your question, the way it does that is all these properties you access through the magic method get, and there's not. I haven't seen any call uses yet, but there's probably some. But yeah, so it's you've seen. I'm not explicitly defining these fields on the model, so it's going through get. So all that magic it's doing in the magic get method.
Just as like a helper, for the rest of your other developers who kind of work with models, PHP Storm is nice that you can editor when you do a lot of uploading on the model, it'll actually say, oh, hey, here's the fields for that thing.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't personally like the magic user field names, but like if that's what you're using, then I would say definitely toss those documents into your class just to hook yourself.
Okay, so that's a good PHP Storm tip. If you're using PHP Storm with Laravel and you want that autocomplete feature, PHP Storm does not disappoint. So that's relationships. What they do. So I'm actually almost done here. Wow, I've been talking for longer than I thought. Sorry, guys. So I'm not going to go too crazy and explain all this logic here. You'll see it. It looks like more logic than is necessary for what I'm doing. But just to explain what's going on, you do a search. I find the first 20 results. I put them in the database. When I click on one, I have to go get it again because I won't have the tracks and I won't have like the release date and some other things about it. So what the application does, it's doing a database hit. Here, it goes and sees, do those already exist in the database? If yes, display them from the database. Otherwise, create a new instance. And here, I'm not hitting the API at all because I already have it in the database. And so it just loads pretty quickly and tells me all my stuff. So I'll relatively quickly run through some of these functions and show you, here's me creating a new track from my API response. I had to create a stupid flag that showed whether or not the album was completely saved or not, because this search results don't show return completed albums, they return partial albums. So I have this silly flag on there. Here I'm calling tracks save many, save all these tracks. I set complete to true. I set some new variable values, and then I call album save. And this is all that has to happen. It's all, you know, it's all pretty standard ORM stuff you might find. It's showcases a lot of the cool stuff about what an ORM is, because, you know, most of this code that I have in here is actually like, I'm just using default values. This could just be like a basically nearly an empty class, and I would get all this functionality out of the ORM. So yeah, generally, I'm actually relatively happy with the way that the ORM works. There's some things that are, you know, I have some nitpicks about it. I don't like not having the fields defined on the class, et cetera, but those aren't huge problems for me. And so now I'm going to talk about a little bit about performance, because I didn't actually delve too deeply into it, but I did look into just a really quick like overhead comparison between Laravel and Symfony, and I will say that it looks pretty much comparable. They're essentially exactly the same, and that's not surprising because I think Laravel is also borrows pretty heavily from Symfony in their core features and core functionality. And in fact, if you look at, you know, Artisan's output, it looks pretty much exactly like the Symfony console command output. And if you look at, you know, Artisan's or the Laravel routes, it looks exactly the same as Symfony's routes, and it's because it is. A lot of this stuff is borrowed from Symfony. So that is that. So conclusions. Laravel's pretty big. Those guys they're doing a lot of stuff. I was kind of coming into it expecting to find things a lot of things I don't like, because usually when I see a project that's doing a lot of things, like creating their own gulp wrapper, creating their own really kind of heavily developed Vagrant box that they're maintaining, and you know, they provide a huge set of libraries, which I encourage everybody to go check out. I haven't really seen anything they do that really gives me serious pause, despite the fact that they are doing a lot. Everything they do seems pretty reasonable to me. You know, here and there are flaws. Some of those things are subjective, so they may not be flaws in everybody's eyes, and they certainly aren't in the developer's eyes, I'm sure. But yeah, that's it. I can recommend Laravel. It's pretty cool. And the end. And so if anybody has questions, I'll try and answer them. I might say I don't know a lot, but otherwise I think we're going to go to a restaurant, which can't support everybody who's here. Probably. They probably can. They're always empty.
Yeah, no, it's funny. Yeah, we can throw a bunch of tables.
So if anybody wants to come hang out, yeah.
So this probably has nothing to do with Laravel, but was it necessary for you to cache the Spotify API results in the database, or is that just
Oh no, that was absolutely unnecessary. That was just because I wanted to show database interaction. It was, yeah, I mean, this app itself is a pretty stupid thing that doesn't need to exist, but you know, the point was to showcase the ORM. And
bonus points for not creating a blog for the example.
yeah, I wanted to do something with a semi-interesting.
I think it's a nice basic thing. With, you know, you're interacting with some outside stuff. I think it's good.
Great.
How long did it take you learning it and doing it?
Well, we can look at my GitHub history, and you'll see that most of what I wrote last weekend. So so 29 total commits. pretty small. Let's hope there's no curse words in here. I guess nobody here cares. But look at April 26th, man. That's the bulk of it right there, all on that one day. And then the rest of it was just reading docs and figuring out. So I started looking at Laravel about a month ago. Pretty super part-time, you know, a couple hours a week at first. And then this last weekend, I just kind of sat down and hammered all this together from what I had been reading about. And it also coincided with a pretty crappy deadline yesterday at work. So I was doing a lot of not this at the same time. So again, you know, I don't know what the best way is. I'll post this link to my GitHub on the meetup. So you guys, in retrospect, I could have done that before the meeting, but so what? So you guys can go just play around with it. You should be able to just install Vagrant and do Vagrant up. Maybe run a composer install first and get everything running pretty quickly, just so you can check out what's going on.
So you use their provided Vagrant file?
I don't. I provided my own. So
Was it difficult to get it running in like your environment?
no, not really. If you're setting up Vagrant, if you're not super familiar with Vagrant, it's kind of a pain to get running the first couple times. But I just went to God, I hate their name, Puffit, whatever that. It's PUPHPET.com.
It's like way more complex now. It has too many options now. There's an extra E after the H.
Yeah. Sorry. So this lets you basically build some Vagrant boxes using their little WYSIWYG editor, not a WYSIWYG, but a little. They've got a builder tool, and it is kind of more complicated than it used to be. But if you know some things about what a server is,
Unless you have some really weird needs, Homestead is great.
Homestead is pretty great.
He's got pretty much everything you could want in it. Redis, Node, Gold. He's got Postgres, MySQL, I think a couple other databases.
Yeah.
He doesn't have Percona, which kind of irks me.
I was more concerned that like when you provide your own, like it makes me consider like, well, maybe configuration is a pain in the ass, and so you got to provide this.
Not unless you're missing something normal.
Okay.
No,
It doesn't really have any.
I mean, the reality is, if you sit down and you're a developer who's never done anything with Vagrant, it's a pretty big learning curve. Yeah, I think that's why they provide it. I mean, it's
right.
If you're like Vagrant's what you want to use, get started. For most people who haven't done anything like that, that's a couple days before they're off the other side. Yeah, and so that's what Homestead is.
Yeah, Homestead helps you get started quickly if you're not super familiar with Vagrant. My preference is I really like the idea of being able to check out a project and do Vagrant up without having to do any local setup. So hopefully I've done that setup for you. So if you don't have Homestead installed, you can just check it out, Vagrant up.
He kind of did it so that like there's some process if you're gonna file a bug, and like you get a Homestead image and like you actually put it in there. That way he can pull down exactly what you got.
That's actually pretty cool. Yeah, I like that a lot.
And then he's got a couple of SASs. One is Forge, which uses his Homestead environment for setting up, basically putting your application on. I think he's got like DigitalOcean, Linode, and a couple other places. And then he's got another one called Envoyer for uninterrupted deployments. And I want to take both of them.